Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's event. My name is Bethany Gaunt, and I'm Associate Director of the Sir Martin Gilbert Learning Centre. The centre, as the name suggests, was established in memory of the late British historian. Sir Martin was the official biographer of Sir Winston Churchill and published a mighty 88 books on 20th century history, focusing on a range of topics including the First and Second World Wars, the Holocaust, the history of Israel, and the history of the modern Jewish experience. Not only was Sir Martin a prolific writer and an incredibly active historian, he also had a real gift for communicating his research clearly, accessibly, and engagingly. The Centre's aim is to continue to bring the areas of history he worked on alive for wide audiences, so it really is a pleasure to see so many of you joining us from around the world today. The Centre is a charity, which means we rely on donations to continue offering the range of high-quality talks we provide across the year. If you enjoy our events, please do consider making a donation. You can donate on our website, and I'll share the link shortly. For today's talk, I'm thrilled to welcome Lady Esther Gilbert, who is joining us from Canada. Esther is, as many of you will know, Sir Martin's widow, and she founded the Centre together with Sir Harry Solomon. Esther first encountered Sir Martin through his writing and helped him with his research for a number of years. She continues to work tirelessly to keep his books available and his legacy alive. She hosts the Martin Gilbert website. I'll post the link in the chat, so do check it out, and shares monthly updates on Martin's focus and approach with her subscribers. Today, Esther will be presenting a series of readings from Sir Martin's books on the bombing of Dresden. Today marks the anniversary of the start of the aerial bombardment of Dresden, so this is a very timely topic. Esther will speak for around 40 minutes, after which we will open up the floor for questions and comments. As always, please post your questions in the chat or to me directly while Esther's speaking, but afterwards we're happy to take your questions out loud if you raise your hand with the function on the screen. But yes, as I say, during the talk, if you could use the chat function, that will help things run smoothly. But thank you so much for taking the time to prepare these readings, Esther, and I will hand over to you now.
Thank you, Bethany, and welcome. Whenever Martin spoke, wherever he spoke, on whatever topic he addressed, he was always asked either one of two questions. Why wasn't Auschwitz bombed? Or why was Dresden bombed? He wanted to write a book, Why Dresden Was Bombed and Auschwitz Wasn't. He never had the chance, but luckily for us, he has written quite a bit about both. A short story before we delve into answering that question, or at least the Dresden part of it. In 1985, Martin gave a talk for the Ministry of Defense at the Soviet Academy of Science in Moscow. It was entitled Britain's Contribution to the Soviet War Effort, and as you'll see, Dresden played its part in that contribution. The talk included information which he later published and is the basis of tonight's discussion. Martin said that after he finished his address, there was complete silence in the auditorium. You could have heard a pin drop and probably also his heart pounding. This was, after all, still Soviet Union, and his audience was military men with their chests covered in war medals. As he reported later to a friend in a letter to a friend, Admiral Amelko, then Vice Chief of the Soviet General Staff and Deputy to General Antonov, sitting in the front row, stood up and said, "I was there and everything Professor Gilbert said is right." He began to clap. And as Martin described it, whereupon 200 hitherto po-faced officers joined in. Needless to say, Martin was relieved. So to begin, and to remind us of the context, I'd like to start with Martin's Second World War, A Complete History. The Second World War was among the most destructive conflicts in human history. More than 46 million soldiers and civilians perished, many in circumstances of prolonged and horrifying cruelty. During the 2,174 days of war between the German attack on Poland in September 1939 and the surrender of Japan in August 1945. By far the largest number of those killed, whether in battle or behind the lines, were unknown by name or face, except to those few who knew or loved them. Yet in many cases, perhaps also numbering in the millions, even those who might in later years have remembered a victim were themselves wiped out. Not only 46 million lives, but the vibrant life and livelihood which they had inherited and might have left to their descendants were blotted out. A heritage of work and joy, of struggle and creativity, of learning, hopes and happiness, which no one would ever inherit or pass on. We're going to focus on one particular event, what led to it, why it happened, and how it happened. The Anglo-American bombing of the German city of Dresden, which took place 78 years ago tonight. Bethany, I'm not moving with my, sorry, a slight technical difficulty.
That's okay.
I do have slides to show you, but nothing's happening.
If you escape, will it do anything, or shall we try the workaround we did a minute ago?
Yeah, I'm gonna try the.
Sorry, just bear with us, everyone. We've got a workaround, I think.
Sorry. Hopefully.
And if you try now, Esther, does that work?
No.
Eek. 1 second. We can always rely on PowerPoints to go smoothly, can't we? No, that's okay. Worryingly now I can't reclaim the host, so this is going really well.
Okay, so why don't I just continue on with the readings, and we'll catch up. Just let me know, Bethany, when you if you can figure this out. We're speaking in English. That's good. Anyway, to give you an idea of what the situation was, when we get to it, is a map of German dominated Europe on the day of the Normandy landings in June 1944. One of the advantages that Britain had in the war against Germany was the codebreakers at Bletchley Park, who in May 1940 broke the Enigma key used by the German Air Force, and between June 1943 and April 1945, the German Naval and Army Enigma keys as well.
There we go.
Fantastic, you've done it.
Sorry, I'm very slow on this, so.
No, that's okay. Is that everybody seeing that? We can see you now, but I think you can try and screen share again, and it might work this time. Sorry, everybody. It's okay. Oh, wait a minute. Did that work?
No, I can't see it.
Okay, now share screen. Share. This is exciting.
Yeah, I can see that now.
Okay, wait, I just need to be able to play. We've done it.
Brilliant.
Yay! Thank you. Okay, where was I? So this is from a small pamphlet that Martin wrote called The Golden Eggs, Churchill and Signals Intelligence. And this is where the Germans got to during the D-Day landings. And moving on to the next map, this is the Allied advances on January 1st. Towards the end of January 1945, a series of Enigma messages revealed a German plan to send reinforcements to the Russian front, then in Silesia, from as far away as the Rhine, Norway, and northern Italy. From a pamphlet now to a slightly larger book, Martin wrote 6 volumes of the 8-volume account of Winston Churchill's life. His volume 7, Road to Victory, is like the other volumes, a day-to-day account of Churchill's long, active, and fascinating life. What exactly did the decrypt say, and what was the result? On January 25, a Joint Intelligence Committee report sent to Churchill and the chiefs of staff stated that the war could be shortened decisively if the British and American strategic bomber force could give assistance to the Russians during the next few weeks. According to this report, the degree of success attained by the new Russian offensive was likely to have a decisive effect on the length of the war. Because of this, the committee believed that the assistance which might be given to the Russians during the next few weeks by the British and American strategic bomber force justified an urgent review of the current bomber targets. The existing targets were, in order of priority, Germany's synthetic oil production factories and oil storage depots and tank factories. These priorities would remain, but added to them would be two others: the devastation of Berlin and an attack on German rail communications in order to delay the German reinforcements, which were being sent to the River Oder battle, some from as far away as Italy, Hungary, and even Norway. The Joint Intelligence Committee report pointed out that a heavy flow of refugees from Berlin, coinciding with the trekking westwards of Germans fleeing from Eastern Germany, would be bound to create great confusion, interfere with the orderly movement of troops to the front, and hamper the German military and administrative machine. There might even be a political value, the report said, in demonstrating to the Russians, in the best way open to us, desire on the part of the British and Americans to assist them in the present battle. Asked that day to comment on this report, Sir Arthur Harris suggested simultaneous attacks on Berlin, Leipzig, and Dresden as focal points of the German system of communications in front of the Red Army. That night in conversation, Churchill had asked Sinclair whether Berlin, and no doubt other large cities in East Germany, should not now be considered especially attractive targets. On the following day, Churchill added, "Pray report to me tomorrow what is going to be done." In passing on Churchill's request to his staff on January 26, Sinclair told them that the Prime Minister wished to know what plans the Air Ministry had for blasting the Germans in their retreat from Breslau. On the following day, Portal informed Sinclair in answer to Churchill's question that in view of the air staff, the Air Ministry should use available effort in one big attack on Berlin and attacks on Dresden, Leipzig, and Chemnitz, or any other cities where a severe blitz will not only cause confusion in the evacuation from the east, but will also hamper the movement of troops from the west. Within 10 days, Churchill was at the Yalta Conference, and here's where Dresden became a discussion. Turning back to the Second World War, on February 4, near Branchiv, American forces breached the outer defenses of the Siegfried Line. That day, in the Crimean resort town of Yalta, Stalin, Roosevelt, and Churchill met to discuss the political problems of post-war Europe, and in particular Poland. After considerable pressure from the two Western leaders, Stalin gave a series of assurances that free elections would be held and that all Polish political parties could participate. These assurances which proved valueless. The Big Three also heard a plea on February 4 by the Deputy Chief of Staff of the Soviet forces, General Antonov, for British and American bombing help to prevent the enemy from transferring his troops to the east from the Western Front, Norway, and Italy. What Antonov asked for was air attacks against communications. This Soviet request for Anglo-American air support was presented to the Big Three at their meeting on the afternoon of February 4, when Antonov told the meeting that the Germans were even then transferring to the Eastern Front 8 divisions from the interior of Germany, 8 from Italy, 3 from Norway, and a further 12 from the Western Front, in addition to the 6 already transferred. Antonov's exaggerated assessment, only 4 divisions were transferred from Italy, for example, led Stalin to ask what Churchill and Roosevelt's wishes were in regard to the Red Army, to which Churchill replied that they would like the Russian offensive to continue. The urgency of the need for some Anglo-American air action to help that offensive continue was made clear by a sentence in the British Cabinet's War Room record that day, in which it was pointed out that between the Oder Bend northwest of Glogau and the Carpathians, all Russian attacks failed in the face of strengthened German resistance. On the following day, in a memorandum for the combined chiefs of staff, the British chiefs of staff agreed to do what is possible to assist the advance of the Soviet army. That same day, at a meeting of the joint British, United States, and Russian chiefs of staff, General Antonov went so far as to warn Western generals that if the Allies were unable to take advantage of their air superiority, they, the Russians, did not have sufficient superiority on the ground to overcome enemy opposition. The British and American chiefs of staff at once agreed to deflect some of their bomber forces from the attack on Germany's oil reserves and supplies, then the current priority, to an attack on the German army's lines of communication in the Berlin, Dresden, Leipzig region. They also agreed at Antonov's suggestion that these 3 specific cities should be allotted to the Allied air forces, leaving the Russian bombers to attack targets further east. Thus, at Yalta, in an attempt to help the Red Army halt the flow of German troops through Dresden and other cities on the Eastern Front, the fate of Dresden, for which bomber Harris remained one of the few major unbombed cities, was sealed. It was Harris who, in his capacity as head of Bomber Command, had for so long resisted the call to focus his strength against Germany's oil resources, preferring to put his faith, which all Allied intelligence, including Ultra, had shown to be misplaced, in the creation of firestorms and rubble. During discussing the military balance of forces, Stalin pointed out to Roosevelt and Churchill at their meeting on February 5 that the Red Army had put 180 divisions in the field against 80 German divisions, a preponderance of over 2-to-1, and went on to ask, how did we stand as regard preponderance of troops in the West? Churchill, answering, explained that neither in France nor Italy did the Anglo-American forces have any large preponderance in infantry, though they had an overwhelming preponderance in the air. On the Western Front, General Marshall told the Big Three the Germans had 79 divisions, albeit greater under strength as against 78 Allied divisions. That night, the Red Army again crossed the Oder, this time at Brig, 25 miles below Breslau. Further north, 2 days later, Soviet troops crossed the river at Fürstenberg, 60 miles from Berlin. The Germans were dismayed. The troops are pretty well fed up to the back teeth, was von Rundstadt's private comment that day. Yet the fanaticism of the German soldier continued to amaze those armies, those whose armies had come so far and won so many battles. In Poznan and Glogau, the German garrisons refused to surrender, while in Breslau, not yet besieged, more than 40,000 troops prepared to resist the Russian attack. On the Western Front, on February 8, Canadian forces launched Operation Veritable, aimed at driving south from Nijmegen to capture the area between the River Maas and the River Rhine, and thus force the Germans from the western bank of the Upper Rhine. On the following day, General de Lattre de Tassigny completed Operation Cheerful against the Germans trapped in a pocket at Colmar. During the battle, which had lasted 20 days, 1,600 French and 540 American soldiers were killed. When the battle ended, the Germans pulled back across the Upper Rhine. 22,000 German soldiers were taken prisoner. That night in Berlin, Hitler was shown an architectural model for the reconstruction of Linz once the war was over. To SS General Kaltenbrunner, who had reported on the sharp fall in public morale, Hitler remarked, "Do you imagine I could talk like this about my plans for the future if I did not believe deep down that we really are going to win this war in the end?" How are they doing, these leaders? And in particular, President Roosevelt, after that first day's meeting? Back to volume 7. Commenting in his diary on this first reunion of the Big Three since Tehran, Admiral Cunningham noted, "The president, who was undoubtedly in bad shape and finding difficulty in concentrating, did not rise to the occasion, but the PM did brilliantly." Cunningham added, "Stalin was good and clear in his points. The PM also very good, but the president does not appear to know what he's talking about and clings to one idea." 5 years later, Churchill recalled the president's feeble health. He was transparent. Roosevelt was indeed a very sick man. Lord Halifax told Churchill 2 months later that Harry Hopkins had doubted if at Yalta the president had heard more than half of what went on round the table. Military session was a success, Eden noted in his diary, Russians being obviously pleased to learn of our plans. The subsequent dinner party did not go well, John Martin wrote to Jock Colville. UJ, as a Republican, refused to drink the king's health, and a jest by the president about the name Uncle Joe did not go down. Angrily, Stalin had asked, "When can I leave this table?" But as Churchill later recalled, James Burns then countered, "After all, you do not mind talking about Uncle Sam, so why should Uncle Joe be so bad?" On this, Churchill recalled, Stalin subsided. President vague and loose and ineffective, noted Eden in his diary. W, understanding that business was flagging, made desperate efforts and 2 long speeches to get things going again. Stalin's attitude to small countries struck me as grim, not to say sinister. We were too many, and there was no steady flow and brisk exchanges as at Tehran. I was greatly relieved when the whole business was over. Discussions continued at Yalta, among them this exchange between Churchill and Stalin, which throws some light on the difference in attitudes which sadly exists till now. We turn to Martha's 1-volume biography of Churchill, Churchill a Life. In the afternoon of February 10, at a private meeting with Stalin at the Yusupov Palace, Churchill agreed to the repatriation to Russia of those Russians who had been taken prisoner by the British while fighting with the German units. Stalin particularly asked that these men should not be ill-treated by the British before they were sent back. Churchill then begged Stalin for good treatment of those British prisoners of war whom the Soviet forces were liberating from prisoner of war camps in the East, telling the Soviet leader, "Every mother in England is anxious about the fate of her prisoner son." Thus was linked the fate of 100,000 Russians, of whom at least 10,000 were to be executed on their enforced return, and 100,000 Britons who were to be welcomed home with enthusiasm. That night, Churchill gave a dinner party at the Vorontsov Villa for Stalin and Roosevelt. After the dinner, he took his guests into the map room. There was something on the maps for each guest. Soviet forces were on the east bank of the Oder, within 38 miles of Berlin. British and Canadian forces were on the western bank of the Rhine. American forces, having returned to the Philippines, had entered Manila. While the big three were in the map room, there was one sour moment. During the discussion of the various military advances, Stalin suggested that the British might wish to make an earlier armistice than the Russians. Churchill, extremely hurt, went to a corner of the map room and with his hands in his pockets, began to sing the opening lines of one of his favorite songs, "Keep Right On to the End of the Road." Stalin was puzzled. Then Roosevelt said with a broad grin to the Russian interpreter Berezhkov, "Tell your chief that this singing by the prime minister is Britain's secret weapon." On the following day, February 11, the big three met at noon to sign a declaration on liberated Europe, holding the right of all peoples to choose the form of government under which they will live, and pledging themselves to the restoration of sovereign rights and self-government to those peoples who had been forcibly deprived of them by the aggressor nations, where necessary in order to help set up interim governments broadly representative of all democratic elements in the populations. The big three would jointly assist in the holding of free elections. The Yalta communique having been signed, Churchill left the Livadi Palace for the last time, returning along the winding hillside road to the Vorontsov Villa. It was shortly after 5 o'clock. He had intended to stay at the villa that night, but as his car drove through its magnificent Gothic entranceway, he suddenly turned to Sarah with the words, "Why do we stay here? Why don't we go tonight? I see no reason to stay a minute longer. We're off." Churchill then sprang out of the car and, hurrying into the private office, announced to his secretariat, "I don't know about you, but I'm off. I leave in 50 minutes. Describing the subsequent turn of events, Sarah told her mother. After a second's stunned silence, everyone was galvanized into action. Trunks and large mysterious paper parcels given to us by the Russians, whoopee, filled the hall. Laundry arrived back clean but damp. Naturally, 50 minutes gave us time to change our minds 6 more times. After endless conflicting suggestions, including going by sea or air, and going to Athens or Cairo or Istanbul, Papa, genial and sprightly like a boy out of school, his homework done, walked from room to room saying, "Come on, come on." By 5:30, the cavalcade of cars was ready, driving westward along the rugged coast, beneath towering bare cliffs, and then, darkness having fallen, leaving the sea to go inland across a mountain pass to Sebastopol. There Churchill boarded the Franconia. "I thought he looked tired," the ship's captain, Harry Grattich, later wrote. But his first question was whether the courier had arrived so that he could get to work. On the following afternoon, Churchill left the Franconia and was driven to the Crimean War battlefields. At the small port which had been the British base in those distant days, Churchill was struck, he later recalled, by the large number of prisoners of war, slaves, Romanians, etc., who were toiling there no harder than they could make them. The Russians were already using the defeated peoples to rebuild their devastated cities. On returning to the Franconia, Churchill asked Grattich if he could have his clothes deloused. This, Grattich noted, defeated us. With the Franconia still anchored off Sebastopol, Churchill worked throughout February 13 in the comfort of his cabin. That night, while he slept, more than 800 British bombers struck at the city of Dresden, dropping 1,471 tons of high explosive bombs and 1,175 tons of incendiaries. A few hours later, American bombers dropped another 689 tons of bombs on the burning city. The Russian purpose, explained at Yalta 8 days earlier, was achieved. Refugees on the road fleeing westward from the firestorm disrupted the movement of German reinforcements seeking to pass through the burning city to the front further east. But the cost, 60,000 civilian dead, was as high as any single raid during the bombing of Europe. So here we are at Yalta, and now we can see the people standing behind Admiral Andrew Cunningham and Air Marshal Charles Portal standing directly behind Prime Minister Churchill, Admiral Harold Stark, commander of U.S. naval forces in Europe, standing behind President Roosevelt, General Alexei Antonov, and I believe the interpreter Valentin Berezhkov standing behind Marshal Stalin. So to recap, this from Churchill and America. On the afternoon of February 10, Roosevelt announced that he would be leaving Yalta on the following day, thus ending the Crimean Conference. The president is behaving very badly, Churchill remarked to his doctor at breakfast on February 11. He won't take any interest in what we are trying to do. That afternoon, the president left Yalta, followed an hour later by Churchill, while both men were on board their respective warships, Roosevelt on the Quincy and Churchill on the Franconia. Another Anglo-American operation of war took place, the bombing of Dresden. On the night of February 13-14, 774 British bombers dropped 2,646 tons of high explosive and incendiary bombs, followed in the morning of February 14 by 450 American bombers, which dropped 689 tons of bombs. This massive and devastating raid was carried out as a result of an urgent Soviet request to interrupt the movement of large numbers of German troops through Dresden toward the embattled Eastern Front. Enigma had revealed these troop movements. The Soviet High Command saw no other way of preventing them than by appealing for help to Britain and the United States. At Yalta, the British, American, and Soviet chiefs of staff had jointly approved the raid. When Churchill learned of the extent of the devastation, he was horrified, calling the destruction of Dresden a serious query against the conduct of Allied bombing. Roosevelt's reaction, he was commander-in-chief of the United States Army Air Forces, is not known. Following a request from Wing Commander A.J. Jim Wright, DFC, RAF retired, to ask Martin to support a campaign to award recognition to the air crew and ground crew, Martin wrote a pamphlet calling it Are We Beasts? Churchill and Bombing Policy. Sorry. This following passage describes Churchill's view on the strategic necessity and yet the huge cost of bombing. As the bombing of railway yards in Northwest France began, Churchill was concerned by the high civilian losses that were expected. At the War Cabinet on 4 April 1944, Portal advised that between 20,000 and 40,000 French civilians might be killed. Churchill told his colleagues he felt some doubt as to the wisdom of the policy. To Portal, he wrote, "You are piling up an awful load of hatred." Churchill asked Eisenhower to set a limit for each raid of, he suggested, an estimated 100 dead. Eisenhower declined. Churchill then put the matter to Roosevelt. These slaughters, he told the president, may easily bring about a great revulsion in French feeling toward their approaching United States and British liberators. They may leave a legacy of hate behind them. The president supported Eisenhower, telling Churchill, "I'm not prepared to impose from this distance any restriction on military action by the responsible commanders that in their opinion might militate against the success of Overlord or cause additional loss of life to our allied forces of invasion." The bombing went ahead. The casualties were high, more than 4,000 civilians dead, but far fewer than feared, and the railway disruptions were effective. From June 1944, even as it played its part in supporting a successful landing in Normandy, Bomber Command was called upon to attack the launch sites and assembly points of two of Hitler's secret weapons, the recently launched V-1 flying bombs and the far more devastating V-2 rocket bombs. Also in June, a plea was made to the Foreign Secretary, Anthony Eden, by the Jewish Agency to bomb the railway lines leading to Auschwitz. Eden passed the request to Churchill, who replied in writing, "Get anything out of the Air Force you can and invoke me if necessary." The bombing would have to be done by day by the Americans from their air bases in southern Italy. The senior American air commander in London, General Eaker, supported Churchill's desire for action. The War Department in Washington, however, turned down the request. The non-bombing of Auschwitz has become controversial. The bombing of Dresden has become even more so. Harris had always wanted Dresden bombed. On 3 November 1943, he had written to Churchill that there still remained to be bombed the central complex, Leipzig, Chemnitz, Dresden. On learning of the effect of the Anglo-American raid on Dresden on 13-14 February 1945, Churchill wrote to Portal, "It seems to me that the moment has come when the question of bombing of German cities simply for the sake of increasing the terror, though under other pretexts, should be reviewed. The destruction of Dresden remains a serious query against the conduct of Allied bombing." Churchill had to be reminded of why Dresden was bombed. The Soviet Union, alerted by Bletchley Park to intercepts of substantial German troop movements toward Breslau, had asked for a special Anglo-American bombing raid to stem the flow of these troops, whom the intercepts showed were being brought eastward from central Germany, Norway, and Italy. In the absence of Churchill and Portal, who were at that very moment en route to Yalta by air, the Soviet request was approved by Clement Attlee and the Vice Chief of the Air Staff. Churchill's minute critical of the Dresden raid was issued on April 1. 3 days later, the Air Staff agreed that at this advanced stage of the war, there was no great or immediate additional advantage to be expected from air attack on the remaining industrial centers of Germany. Churchill assumed that the new policy would be strictly followed. He was therefore puzzled 2.5 weeks later to read that aircraft had been sent on the night of April 14 to bomb Potsdam. He wrote at once to Sinclair and Portal, what was the point of going and blowing down Potsdam? In reply, Portal pointed out that this attack had come about following a report of the Joint Intelligence Committee describing the evacuation of the German Air Force operational headquarters from Berlin to Potsdam. Another object of the raid, Portal explained, was to destroy communications leading west from Berlin through Potsdam. Portal's reply ended with reference to Churchill's earlier protest of March 28. In accordance with your decision on the recommendations of the Chiefs of Staff, we've already issued instructions to Bomber Command that area bombing designed solely with the object of destroying industrial areas is to be discontinued. The attack on Potsdam, however, Portal explained, was calculated to hasten the disintegration of enemy resistance. Germany surrendered to the Allies on 8 May 1945. Churchill's all-party coalition government was replaced by a caretaker conservative administration, which was defeated in the general election in July. The distribution of honors for wartime leadership fell to the new Labour government, headed by Clement Attlee, who had been Deputy Prime Minister for the last 2 years of the war, and who, as Deputy PM, had approved the Dresden raid in Churchill's stead. Attlee declined to award Sir Arthur Harris a peerage. Churchill was not pleased, writing to Attlee on 6 January 1946 about Harris. No CNC in the RAF after Lord Dowding bore so heavy a burden as he, and none contributed more distinguished qualities to the discharge of his duty. As Minister of Defense, I had the opportunity and duty of watching his work very closely, and I greatly admired the manner in which he bore the altogether peculiar stresses of planning and approving these repeated, dangerous, and costly raids far into the heart of the enemy's country. For nearly 4 years, he bore this most painful responsibility and never lost the confidence or loyalty of Bomber Command, in spite of the fact that it endured losses equaled only in severity by those of our submarines in the Mediterranean. Unmoved by Churchill's plea, Attlee would not reconsider his decision. Jim Wright died last June, a few weeks short of his 100th birthday, without success in his campaign for recognition for Bomber Command. Let's see if I can stop this. No. Yes. Did I do it? Yay!
You did.
Martin spoke at a Churchill conference in Washington, D.C. in 2004. I'd like to close with this story, which was published by the Churchill scholar, Richard Langworth, who I believe is with us today. Martin was asked by the moderator of the talk, Juan Williams, why then has the controversy over Dresden never ceased? Martin replied, who can say why one out of thousands of historical events creates interest while others do not? The firebombing of Tokyo was far more devastating, and yet we never hear Tokyo discussed. To bomb Dresden at the request of the Soviets was but one small part in a broad campaign. Churchill didn't even order it, and yet there's no reason to suppose he would have reacted any differently than Attlee. Martin ends his bombing command pamphlet with the Churchill reflection, my only regret is that mankind ever learned to fly. Thank you, and I welcome any comments, questions.
Thank you. Thank you, Esther. That was brilliant. That was really, really insightful. And I don't know if you had an eye on the chat, probably not as you were working your PowerPoint, but it was buzzing with controversy, people on both sides of the fence as to whether the bombing of Dresden is a war crime or not. So it's clearly still an emotive issue. As Esther said, she's happy to take your questions viva voce. If you've got them, you feel free to raise your hand. And while people are organising their thoughts, I wondered if you could talk to us a little bit about Martin's approach when it came to researching and writing his history. It would be great to hear more about that.
I think he read history, he read modern history. He was interested in history and making atlases and writing. And then he was invited to be part of Randolph Churchill's writing of his father's biography. And in Martin's book, In Search of Churchill, he writes about what that experience was like and how he became the Churchill biographer. But Randolph sent him all over the country, delving into private archives and public archives. So you can tell from his writing, he's basing his writing, his history on what the documents, the official documents say, with perspective and views from those who were there. So he quotes from diaries, he quotes from letters, he quotes from, and weaves it all together so that we have what happened and how it happened and why from the people who were there. And he just gives us the story and allows us to come to our own conclusions. So I think that's enough of me. Let's hear what.
Yeah, that's brilliant, and it's remarkable that he was able to do that about such a wide range of history. So we're very lucky to have all those books.
I think because he spent so much time working on Churchill's life, and Churchill had such a long and interesting life, Martin really learned a lot about the 20th century and the First and Second World Wars, and then through his own interest, he was interested in the Holocaust and Jewish history also.
Brilliant. Roddy, I'm going to ask you to unmute so you can